You're interested in Buddhism and the ideas of it, the practice of it perhaps, but is it necessary to become a Buddhist? We'll talk about that in today's video. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel and click the bell down below if you want to receive notifications when I come out with new videos. So on today's video, what we'll discuss is this question of becoming a Buddhist. I did an earlier video on how to become a Buddhist, where I went through various options given the school and so on, because there are different ways, different approaches. It was a popular video, which doesn't surprise me because the question has been a question that comes up a lot, that I get on my videos, is how do you become a Buddhist? Is there some way? But I want to sort of step back from that question a bit and ask whether it's important at all to become a Buddhist. And what I want to do here, first of all, is to set up the question by looking at, in particular, the Western religious approach. Because I think many of us who ask this question come from a Western religious background, either ourselves or in our culture, in which becoming a particular kind of thing or a person is particularly important. After discussing religion in the West, we'll then turn to Buddhism in the second part of this video. But to begin with, within a sort of a Western context with which most of us are familiar with, this notion of religion, of a kind of religious belonging, is really a notion of identity, of attachment in a certain way. Many of us may know that the word religion has at least one etymology of the word religion, is that it comes from the Latin word religare, which means being bound to or attached to. It probably is I would say, the same word as ligament. Ligament is a contemporary word which has the same origin, I would think, in Latin. And the idea is that we have certain obligations to this divine being that make us bound to that being. So the Western notion of religion is a notion of obligations of a certain kind. And in the Bible, where much of these ideas come from, the notion of God is very proprietary. It has to do really with identity and property of one kind and another. Many people misinterpret the first commandment as saying that there's only one God. In fact, the first commandment says that you shall have no other gods before me. And within the context of where this commandment was composed back in ancient Israel, there was a notion of multiple deities. That is to say, the first commandment is written that way because there was indeed a notion of multiple deities, a competition between deities of different cultures, as it were. And so the deity of the Israelites was to be held above the deities from other cultures. That people who subscribe to these commandments should have no other deity before that one. That one should be the highest. That was the deity of their culture. And in this context, religions essentially function as cultural badges of belonging, where in order to belong to a culture, or one of the aspects of belonging to a culture, was subscribing to the religious beliefs and approaches of that culture. So if you were an Israelite, you subscribed, you undertook the religion of that deity, which involved having that deity as your main deity. And so that gave you certain obligations to that deity, which were, among other things, to keep the commandments. That was your obligation, to keep the laws that this deity had purportedly put down. And so that was your obligation, and then the deity again had obligations to you. That is, we essentially pledge allegiance to our tribe by accepting the tribe's deity and the commandments, the laws that that deity purportedly laid down. In response, the deity then has obligations of performing good things for us, giving us As originally in the Old Testament or the Jewish Bible, the early part of the Bible, these the things that the deity would provide to us were basically worldly goods, worldly ends, providing us a good life, providing us success, both in the battlefield and in the home, giving us a protection against our enemies. Those are the kinds of things that we could expect to find the deity providing us. That is to say, if we did our part, the deity would do its part. And this was essentially it's been described as a kind of a contract that you had with the deity. You did your part, the deity then would reciprocate. This is how it was. This is generally how it's found in the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible. It's also, interestingly, how it's found in the Vedas. The Vedas are the old texts, very, very old, again, many thousands of years before the Common Era, that were the foundation of the Brahminic religion, into which the Buddha was born. I mean, he wasn't really born into it, he was on the outskirts of it, but in any event, he certainly knew of it and responded to it. And also in the Vedic religion, we have the same idea of really this notion that the Brahmins, who were the priestly caste, had to perform certain kinds of rituals, certain kinds of sacrifices in return for worldly goods from the deities. That is a long life, success, fertility, health, and all the rest. Now, while these worldly success, or I should say, while these successes that the deities provided to us were, to begin with, worldly, as these religious ideas advanced and became more sophisticated, particularly in, let's say, the later books of the Jewish Bible, or in the case of the Brahminic religion, as we got into the Upanishads, which were written later than the Vedas, or actually around the time of the Buddha, a few centuries before to a few centuries after the Buddha's lifetime, then we get more of the idea that the gods or God will provide us a good afterlife. That is to say, the idea of an afterlife is a relatively later kind of idea. It wasn't original to these texts, because originally what the people who composed these texts were interested in was really more about this life, more about how we gain success here and now, and only in time did these more sophisticated ideas of an afterlife come into it. And indeed, we might think of all of this as modeling the society at the time, where you have a society of small chieftains, chieftainships, you might say, surrounded by other chieftains around them that were threatening them. And the idea was that we as lowly commoners, without any real ability to defend ourselves against a powerful overlord, would pledge our allegiance to the local chieftain. And there was this kind of implicit contractual obligation there, that we would pledge our help in certain circumstances, and the chieftain would at least nominally pledge to protect us in the case that we were invaded by some enemy, or there were some other kind of catastrophe, like a flood or whatever. So there was this worldly contract between the more powerful and the less powerful, which was then modeled onto this notion of the supernatural, the idea that the gods were sort of larger chieftains writ large in the sky, who would protect us from much more grand kinds of problems and give us much more grand, potentially, kinds of solutions. Now, breaking these bonds would have been a big problem. That is to say, just as breaking the bond of a local chieftain with you would set you up for big problems, so too would breaking the bond between yourself and the religion that you happen to be belonging to. That is to say, this bond, this religare, this attachment, was the sort of thing that you only broke at your own peril. Now, when it came to literal chieftains, of course, if you were to go against your local chieftain, you could be obviously punished by them directly, but even lesser punishments, such as ostracism, being kicked out, were really very, very threatening, very dangerous, because once you were kicked out of your own group, it wasn't clear who would protect you in the case that somebody fell upon you. you were then set up for potentially being attacked, killed by anybody else. There would be nobody there to be on your side. So all of this is to say that religions at the time when they were created, many of these, were very serious things. And for many of us nowadays, they remain very serious kinds of badges of identity, which create very, very strong bonds between ourselves and some idea of the supernatural, and which can indeed have severe repercussions within this lifetime among our peers. And many of us take this over to Buddhism. That is to say, we think of Buddhism perhaps in a similar kind of fashion. So now turning to the case of Buddhism, what I'm going to be discussing here is early Buddhism in particular, because that's really what interests me most of all. And Buddhism is such a huge topic that it would be impossible for me anyway to summarize all of it in a single video. But when it comes to early Buddhism, oftentimes it's said that there wasn't a term Buddhism, so Buddhism is a relatively modern kind of term. And so, therefore, we shouldn't think of Buddhism as a religion. Now, I've done an earlier video on whether or not Buddhism is a religion. My impression is that it's sort of both a religion and not a religion, but that's a sort of a separate topic here. Related topic, but separate. In any event, while there wasn't a term for Buddhism back in the day, there nevertheless was definitely an idea of the Buddha Dharma, that is to say, the teaching of the Buddha, as separate from the teachings of other people around who were not the Buddha, who disagreed with the Buddha, or the teaching of, let's say, the Vedas, the gods, whether they were Vedic gods or gods from the territory, which also, in a certain sense, was competition for the Buddha's own teachings. Now, when it came to those of other belief systems, those people who propounded different kinds of teachings, the Buddha argued strenuously with them, with some who argued that there was no difference between right and wrong, with others who argued for complete fatalism, that is to say that everything that ever happened was already set up in advance and there was nothing we could do to change anything. Or still others, who argued that the route to true awakening was in complete non-action, so that the best way forward was not to do anything at all. These are the kinds of positions, they may be straw man, that is to say, they're coming, a lot of them, through the Buddha, so we may not have the entire picture of what they were teaching. Nevertheless, what is clear from these early texts is that the Buddha was in a direct argument with other people. The Buddha was also in direct argument with this notion of deities, the deities of his day. As I say, not largely, or at least partly, from the idea of the Vedic gods. And the Buddha was very clear in saying that there weren't any such thing as beings, sentient beings, who were all-powerful and all-knowing and ethically perfect. This notion of God in the theological Western sense, the Buddha said didn't exist, and in particular, the Buddha did not believe that there were immortal beings. That is to say, his general position was that there were powerful beings out there. He did believe in what we would call devas, which is a sort of a term which could be translated as gods. But these devas were not all-powerful. They were certainly not all-knowing. They were mortal beings, although they lived very, very, very long lives. They were not people that we should look up to. Indeed, the Buddha, we know that the Buddha felt himself in some competition with such ideas, because in several of these early suttas, the Buddha ridicules these gods as basically being ignorant blowhards, as beings who, although they were powerful, didn't really know very much. And indeed, the Buddha styled himself in these early suttas as, he said, the teacher of gods and men. That is to say, that it wasn't that he learned from the gods in the sense of the Western religion, where, let's say, religions are revealed by the deities to humans. Instead, in Buddhism, it's quite the reverse. The idea is that the Buddha is the person who is the wise one, who knows the wisdom of the world, and the deities are relatively ignorant, and they come to the Buddha time and again in the suttas, at least it's presented that way. They come down to the Buddha to learn about wisdom from him, because he was the fount of knowledge. And what do these deities learn from him? What do all of us learn from him? Well, we learn about unbinding, about non-attachment. These are the kinds of things we learn. We learn about how our desire for permanence in the world, our desire for immortality, these desires of ours are the sorts of things that produce suffering, because the world does not reciprocate. We desire permanence, but permanence is not to be found. And so in that desire, what we end up reaping is suffering, or a sense of unsatisfactoriness, that things are never really quite right. Similarly, we want immortality, and yet death is always before us. That's the same thing. Now, I think we may see that this is, in certain ways, the very opposite of the message of traditional religion. That is to say, it's not that we bind ourselves through some kind of contractual obligation to some supernatural deity who is going to be providing us with solace and success, but rather we unbind ourselves from all worldly phenomena. We understand that all things change, that all things decay. We understand that even the Dharma itself will pass away, so even with respect to the Dharma, we're not supposed to cling to it, at least in the final analysis. That we understand that all of these things are not who we are. That is to say, from all of these phenomena, we unbind our notion of self from them. Now, in some religions, this methodology, this method that I've just mentioned with respect to Buddhism, this kind of method is used to unbind us from all worldly phenomena in order, therefore, to bind us to the unworldly phenomena or phenomenon of the God, the deity, or to ourselves. Indeed, that is the strategy that's used in the Upanishads, which are these group of texts that were being composed around the time of the Buddha and that the Buddha probably knew about. And in the Upanishads, we do have the idea of unbinding ourselves from all worldly phenomena so that we focus on the self and understand in that religion that the self is identical to Brahman, which is this universal principle that could be identified with God. So that we unbind ourselves from everything else except for ourselves and God, or just God if you like, because this is the same thing. For the Buddha, however, that was not the process. In fact, the Buddha argued against that kind of approach. The Buddha's approach was the exact opposite. That is to say, that we unbind ourselves from everything, including the self. That we stop binding, no matter how we can conceive of something or think of it or hold to it or see it or experience it, we unbind ourselves from it. And in a profound kind of system like this, a profound kind of approach like this, we might well wonder what the point is of becoming a Buddhist. Now, it's important to stress, because I'm discussing early Buddhism here, that in the Buddha's day, people did indeed, in a sense, bind themselves to the Buddha, because they would, when they heard the Buddha's speaking, if they agreed with what he was saying, oftentimes in the suttas it is described that they would say that they would take refuge in the Buddha as their teacher, that they would take refuge in the Dharma as their teaching or their practice, and they would take refuge in the Sangha as the group of monastics. So this taking of refuge is a kind of binding of ourselves, or at least it was in the Buddha's day and continues down to this day among traditional Buddhists, a kind of binding of ourselves to the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, to the Triple Gem as it's called. Now, why do we do this? Well, I think it's it can be, I should say, a skillful means of providing us, shall we say, energy and confidence in our undertaking along the path. So it's a kind of psychological move that we can do to give ourselves more confidence because we feel that we are, in some sense, attached, although in the final analysis that attachment will have to be let go in order to get to the final end. But nevertheless, in the meanwhile, we use this kind of skillful approach, skillful means, of doing something which, again, in the final analysis is something that may not be great for us, but right now gives us energy and confidence. And I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. The problem can come in when this attachment, this feeling of belonging curdles into something harsher, curdles into something more about a dogma and a strong belief, this kind of clinging to views, which can lead to strong attachment and indeed to enmity with others, to arguments and disputes, to anger, hatred, violence. These are the kinds of things that can happen if we allow attachment to curdle into something really dangerous. And I think it's because of an awareness of such dangers that many contemporary followers of the Buddha Dharma, or people who practice the Buddha Dharma, aren't really comfortable with the label Buddhist, because they feel that that's the sort of label, any kind of label, but that particular label, is a label that is bound up in the idea of religion, therefore bound up in the idea of holding to dogmas and views, and so it's the sort of thing that they should set to one side. And I think also that makes a whole lot of sense, because the final aim here is an aim of unbinding. It's an aim of getting ourselves away from these kinds of bounds of identity, these kinds of cords that keep us attached to various ways that we see the world. After all, in one of the Buddha's most famous similes, the Buddha compared the Dharma to a raft, which is meant to get us across the river of samsara, across the river of sorrow, if you like, to the farther shore, but that once we got to that farther shore, we would have to leave the raft behind. It wasn't the sort of thing we carried around with us. Now, we have to use that raft to cross this river, so there's not an idea of getting off the raft in the middle of the river. That wouldn't be very useful. So we have to be balanced here in how we approach all of these things. Now, so the question then becomes, is it necessary to become a Buddhist? And what I would say is, it's not necessary at all to become a Buddhist in order to practice the Buddha Dharma, in order to practice Buddhism. Many of us, and you, may find it helpful to consider yourself that way, and others of you may consider it harmful to use that kind of term. Whatever you find useful, I think you should follow your own advice. I don't think there's any immediate advice from the Buddha on this. The labels are just labels after all. Now, I have a number of videos on similar kinds of topics, on whether Buddhism is a religion and so on. I'll put those down below. But one that I think is particularly interesting in this context has to do with Buddhism and atheism, or what the Buddha's views about the deities were. I did an earlier video about that, so I'll put a link to it up here on the screen. It might be useful or interesting to take a look at. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you all on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, all of you, be well.